Good morning, now afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you. I know some folks are out in the streets today, which is a good place to be. But for those of us who can't, this is also a good place to be. And we're going to just plow ahead in our study of the Mishnah. And today, we're going to take a look at one of the really towering figures in rabbinic literature altogether, one of the great, like the classic names, Rabban Gamliel. And even there, you can hear there's something a little unusual about it because we call him Rabban Gamliel. He was the first person to hold that title, and that meant our rabbi, not Rabbi means my master, Rabbi, my master. Rabban is like our master, which suggests that the term rabbi in general is a term that means like my master in teaching, but it suggests that he was the teacher of all of Israel. Now there's a reason for that, and that is that and it's not so much for his scholarship per se. It is more that he played a very particular role at a very critical juncture in Jewish history in the decades before the Roman-Jewish wars, but while the Romans had taken over and established a province. And so we're in this sort of murky period where the Romans haven't kicked us out or forced leadership on us, but they have forced us, but like we as the inheritors of the Judaism of this period, they have forced them to submit in the way that Roman authorities do. And that means that Rabban Gamliel presided over Israel. And I say presided because he was the head of the Sanhedrin. And the effective leader, the Nasi, which we now translate as president, sometimes translated as prince, of the Jewish community in the land of Israel. He was the head of this community at a very tense period where on the one hand, the Romans were sort of encroaching, but on the other hand, there was some attempt to preserve, like, could we survive in this sort of middle space where Judaism would exist and Israel would be sovereign, but only so sovereign they would have to contend with Roman authorities. That eventually didn't work out. That whatever Pax Romana there was established eventually exploded and turned into riots and then war and then eventually the destruction of the temple. So that's that's where he was at, and so he was desperate he was a politician, I guess is what I'm trying to say. More than he was a Rebbe, he was a politician, and he was really desperate to establish a kind of stable and unified Jewish community. He was a rabbi, and he was trying to establish it under rabbinic law, and he was trying, there were a lot of factions at the time because Judaism was starting to seem very vulnerable. A lot of factions, most famously the Sadducees and the Pharisees, right? Rabban Gamliel was like the ultimate Pharisee. He was taking up that side of the debate. In fact, he's recorded in the book of Acts by Paul as the great Pharisee teacher. And some say that Paul was his student, right? That's sort of a funny way to think of history, right? Rabban Gamliel and right, Jesus and Paul. But anyway, he was a Pharisee, but he was also above all, he was a Pharisee, and I should say he was also the grandson of Hillel the Elder. So he came of like really venerable lineage. And before that of Shimon HaTzadik, which means he also came from the priesthood. I'm just throwing information at you, but I do that to say that there was something about Rabban Gamliel was thought to be like, he was the one, he was the leader, he had inherited the mantle, he was forging the Jewish people ahead into an uncertain future. And by all accounts, he was successful in a sense. I mean, he died before the temple was destroyed. So whether he was preventing it or not, it's hard to say, but he was an amazing leader in a time of crisis, in some ways. In other ways, Rabban Gamliel is a deeply problematic figure. And for all of the sort of the fame and glory of Rabban Gamliel, for the title of our Rabbi Rabban Gamliel, Rabban Gamliel's actual descriptions, once we get to the Talmud, are often either overtly or subtly very critical of him. He was, by all accounts, imperious and dominating. Famously, he commanded Rabbi Yoshua to, when they disagreed on a matter of Jewish law that would determine when Yom Kippur fell, Rabbi Yoshua said, no, Rabban Gamliel's made a mistake, and Yom Kippur is the following day. And Rabbi Gamliel, so outraged that someone would contradict his authority, commanded Rabbi Joshua to travel to see him on the day that Rabbi Yoshua thought it was Yom Kippur, which was thought to be like a great humiliation, intellectual affront. Rabbi Joshua is also one of the great rabbis of the day. So that's the kind of guy that Rabban Gamliel was. And by the way, when Rabbi Yeshua submitted and did it, Rabban Gamliel then like rushes out with like this beautiful, warm hug and smile and says, "Oh my gosh, you've taught me something today. You're my student and my teacher," like as if making nice, but had totally humiliated this guy. Okay, and Rabban Gamliel is also known as an elitist, and one of the famous narratives of Rabban Gamliel in the Talmud has him barring the doors to the study hall for only those that he feels are qualified to get in. And that story, in some ways, becomes a kind of symbol for like our discussions today around access into Jewish community. Well, Rabban Gamliel was not. He was an elitist. He was not accessible, and because of that, he was temporarily overthrown by his own cadre of students. Okay, that's a good place to head into our Mishnah today, because we're going to see some tension between Rabban Gamliel and his students, and we now have a sense that Rabban Gamliel's. I wanted just to play the 2 Chainz song. You know, the "I'm different," because but it's indecent, so I couldn't play it. But he's just different. He's a little different. That's Rabban Gamliel is just a little different, and that's important for us to keep in mind. Now, one last thing before we dive in, which is if you've been following this series from the start, that is, if you were at the first session, then you've already met Rabban Gamliel. We've been discussing the reading of the Shema. Does anyone remember how Rabban Gamliel very early on weighed into the discussion of when we recite the evening Shema? Someone remember that? Just like I'm going to recall one of our earlier sessions. Ruth, you remember?
I remember what he said. I don't remember, but I remember the discussion about what time.
Okay, good. And what he said is only a part of it, because there's a question of what time, and then there's a story about Rabban Gamliel. Anyone remember? There are opinions. There are various opinions. Can you read the Shema? When do you read the Shema? You can read it for the first third of the night. No, you can read it for half the night, right?
Was it Rabban Gamliel's sons that were allowed, or he said it was okay because they came home late and he just allowed them to?
Correct. Beautiful. Amazing thing that the very first Mishnah in the Talmud has this story about how the leading rabbi of the generation dealt with the situation where his sons were basically out drinking and came home and were like, "Oh, we forgot to recite the Shema." And Rabban Gamliel says, that's okay. You can recite it until the morning. And in fact, whenever you hear that the rabbis teach you like, oh, you can only do this till midnight, they don't really mean that. You can do it all the way till the morning. Okay? Now we spent a lot of time discussing that, but that gives you a taste of exactly the kind of legal thinking that we're going to encounter in Rabban Gamliel today. Like, oh, I know that's the law, but like, don't worry about it. And the fact that it's his family member, that might be significant as well. We're going to try and figure that out. So Rabban Gamliel in that moment appears, for all his rigidity, to be somewhat like flexible in certain ways. So that he's an unpredictable guy, and it's a little bit hard to pin him down. But one of the best illustrations that we have of who Rabban Gamliel was is in the Mishnah. And this is one of the advantages of reading Mishnah as opposed to Talmud, because you just see a bunch of Mishnah. The Mishnah has its own narrative. And you can see as we read through the second half of the second chapter of Mishnah Brachot, we're going to see that it's almost like we're getting a series of scenes in Rabban Gamliel's life that's meant to teach us something. And I think what it's meant to teach us, I don't know what it's meant to teach us exactly, but I think it's something important enough to really reflect on, not just because of Rabban Gamliel, but because of the philosophy of Jewish living that he seems to be advocating. Okay, so here we go. We're heading in. The question that we're dealing with here, we've been looking at the Shema, and the question that we're dealing with is, are you ever exempt from reciting the Shema? In fact, here, I'm going to give you the source sheet, and then we're going to look at it. All right, in the chat, here comes the source sheet. Okay, so let me now start. Okay. Okay, here we go. So we're in Mishnah Brachot, and we're going to start with the question, well, hey, are you ever exempt from the reciting the Shema? I'll tell you, if we go into Mishnah Brachot, the very last Mishnah, the one right before, said that workers can recite the Shema on the top of a tree or on the top of a roof, right? So the places, you might think you are no longer obligated to recite the Shema because you're in a dangerous situation. No, you can do it up there on the roof. It's a little bit like Sam I Am, you know? I can recite it in the plane, I can recite it in the rain. But then the Mishnah comes and says, well, there are situations, there's one in particular, where you are exempt from the reciting the Shema. So this in itself is an interesting Mishnah, though eventually we'll focus on Rabban Gamliel. Okay, Chatan patur mikriyat Shema b'layla harishon ad motzei Shabbat. Im lo asa ma'aseh. A groom, right, someone who has just gotten married, is exempt from reciting the Shema on the first night of his marriage until the end of Shabbat, right? So somewhere, he got married sometime in the middle of the week. They say it was often on Wednesday. He no longer has to recite the Shema for the rest of the week until after Shabbat. Okay, that's wild. But then there's a qualifier, as long as he has not performed the act. Okay, meaning euphemism, right? As long as he's not consummated the marriage. Now, let's just think about that for a sec. A groom does not have to recite the Shema as soon as he gets married until for a few days, as long as he hasn't had sex yet with his bride. Why would that be? I mean, it's kind of a bizarre thing to start talking about, but think about it for a sec. You recite Shema, you just got married. Why would the rabbi say, it's okay, don't recite Shema for the next few days? You're exempt. Wendy?
Oops, sorry. I think maybe because we've been talking about the fact that when you study Torah, you're not to think about sex, basically. Now, it's his duty. He needs to perform sex. So he needs to be focusing on consummating the marriage with his wife, and not so much the intellectual, get more into the physical. And that, I'm thinking, may be his reasoning, because that also is a holy act. Oh, right. You know, it's important.
I'm hearing two layers in what you're saying, because you started off by saying, you know, you're not supposed to be thinking about sex when you do other things like something holy, like, you know, reciting the Shema. And that is definitely one of, we're here interpreting, the rabbis interpreted too, to try to figure out what's going on here. One of the interpretations is, well, he's just about to have sex for the first time, so that's all he can think about, and that's just not a clear head to be reciting holy words. Like, he's just like, you can't, how could you blame the guy, right? It's like, this is a big exciting moment. So that's one way of thinking about it, is his mind is too clouded with sexual thoughts, improper to the Shema, whatever. But you said another thing, which is that actually the more major way that you approached it was to say, no, having that sex is important. It's a mitzvah in a sense, and osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. When you're involved in one holy act, you don't leave it aside to go perform another holy act. It's okay. Direct yourself on this holy thing, marriage, right? Those are in some ways two different answers, though compatible. Beryl?
I can't remember what conversation it was last week, but it was something about prayer and like feeling something very intensely. So I was wondering if maybe instead of just like separating prayer, the Shema, and like physical being and intense emotion, like would there be a reason for actually to, like while you are very aroused, to actually do that, to recite the Shema? And it was just like an alternative to this idea of separation when actually we want to have them together. Okay,
yeah, I mean, that's interesting, right? That's interesting because that's exactly where the Mishnah goes. Rabban Gamliel, as we're going to see, is going to challenge the very notion that they ought to be separate, right? Like, maybe you would think, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to unify God's name as I consummate my marriage. That sounds awesome, right? So, okay, so hold on to that thought. All right, let's. I'm going to take one more comment. Nick.
Does it have anything to do with any kind of like ritual impurity that may impede somebody from saying the Shema? Because I'm thinking like, you know, if this is like a couple days after the marriage, like, and also let's acknowledge that this is just like focused on a man's obligation and prayer and this and that. So like, I think that's important to put out there. And that we're not speaking in an egalitarian sense, unfortunately. But I wonder if there's like a level of ritual impurity. Maybe they're like, just take that out of the mix because they're already so stressed. Like we should just free them up to like do the thing they need to do whenever they need to do it. And then when it's done, we can go back to normal.
Yeah, I think there's something to this. I don't think they're so concerned with the impurity. That doesn't seem to be at stake here, but in a more general sense, like being in the proper state. And I want to just highlight specifically one word you said, which is I think one last interpretation that the rabbis are offering that we haven't given yet, which is you use the word stress. And I think that's also what you could say, like he's still thinking about sex too much, but actually the rabbi more commentaries suggest that he's tarud, he's just distracted, he's nervous, right? He's not going to have sex for the first time he's excited, he's going to have sex for the first time he's petrified, and so he can't, like, that's all he can think about, right? Like, he's just like, this is going to be terrible, and right, there are some wild commentaries in there, you know, like, of the thing, you know, he's afraid he'll get hurt, he's afraid, okay, so that's the law, okay? But now we're going to take a look at Rabban Gamliel, who is, as Two Chains says, different. Okay, the story goes that Rabban Gamliel did recite Shema on the first night after he had married. Okay, so I want you to just think, we'll finish the Mishnah, but I want you to just think like, well, what do you mean? Like, was that, he recited it anyway? Was that a good thing? Why did he do that? Okay, are we reading, oh, cool, or is this a violation of the law? Okay, his students said to him, they seemed shocked, our master, have you not taught us that a groom is exempt from the reciting the Shema? We heard it from you. You taught us this. Now, this is a very strange answer, and we're sort of going to be grappling with it for the rest of our time together. Amar lehem, eini shomea lechem levatel mimeni malchut shamayim afilu sha'achat. He replied to them, I will not listen to you to remove myself from the kingship of heaven, even for a moment. Now, last week, you may recall that we said that one of the kavanot, one of the intentions that we ascribe to the Shema is that you are accepting upon yourself ol malchut shamayim, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. So there's a familiar phrase there that it refers to the Shema, but it's like a bigger purpose of the Shema. Okay, so that decoding at least we can do. But what in the world is he saying here? I mean, their question, I don't know, if like, it seems pretty straightforward to me. It seems like they're saying, this doesn't seem right. You taught us differently. Although there are various versions of what they might be asking. Oh, is there something we don't know? Or are they asking, have you violated something? How you've contradicted yourself? Whatever it is, I leave that also to your interpretation, but it's a little more straightforward than his answer, which is not, that's not the case, or here's another thing, but I will not listen to you in order to take away from myself the kingdom of heaven, even for a moment. What is Rabban Gamliel saying here? What does that mean, Hannah?
It seems to me like a really annoying, self-righteous version of do as I say, not as I do. But it's like in a way to glorify himself. I think often people use that expression as a way to be like, yeah, I'm not quite doing what I'm supposed to do, but don't listen, don't watch what I'm doing, just listen to what I'm saying. But it seems like he's like, yeah, for these very lesser people like you, that's fine. You can be exempt from it. But I, in my mighty greatness, would never choose to be exempt from the divine.
Okay.
What else was going on for me?
Okay. Great. Other characterizations? Bob.
Yeah, I think I would give him the benefit of the doubt a little bit more. And I think we've talked about this in your other classes, Rabbi David. I don't remember if it was the Mishnah or the Orthodox class, but the notion of making the law more accessible to the greater masses. And so maybe his first comment about the Shema and the groom, he's thinking about how to allow people, knowing, as we discussed, the difficulties that might be there for a groom, but how to allow them to still be within the general applicability of the law. But for him, he's saying it's like, yeah, I'm allowing people to be more liberal, but for me, I don't need that. And, I'm going to be a little bit more strict in the interpretation.
Okay, beautiful. We've got two very strong readings here of essentially the same sort of sequence of thoughts, but with very different characterizations, right? Hannah is saying that this is a guy who, well, let me start with Bob's version first, because it's easier to like present the generous and then critique. Bob says that Rabban Gamliel, what we were learning from Rabban Gamliel is that he is willing to accommodate different needs, different stresses, different capabilities, and he wants everybody to be involved. And as he said to his sons, don't worry, if you haven't done it yet, you still have until morning. He understands that sometimes you get drunk. He understands that people they're not always like, jumping to do mitzvot, but like we can figure out a way that everybody is allowed to do mitzvot. I personally am going to do the Shema before midnight. And I personally don't even need to, like, I can say the Shema with full intention. I'm able to do this, but you have. So in other words, we read the initial law as permission not to say the Shema, not you cannot say the Shema. There is like a kind of a halachic implication there. Hannah, on the other hand, thinks that what he is saying is, okay, there is a law, but I just want you, and I will teach the law, and that's the correct law, but I just want you to know I hold to a higher standard. Right? That's like what you're doing is that's nice for a common Jew, but I am exalted. I am the great Rabban Gamliel. The kingdom of heaven is upon my a mantle at all times, right? So two very different ways of reading what is essentially the same sort of legal reality, which is there's space for you to choose. I, though, will not take all that space. Okay, now that's interesting because in the next Mishnah, we're going to see a little bit of a flip. It's going to be we're going to keep exploring this logic, but in a way that I think is going to like tangle us up. Okay, before we move forward, I saw a hand. David, do you want to jump in?
Oh, well, I was kind of in a comedic way. Our students were privy to his to his sex life, but then it may imply to them, I will not listen to you. There may be a little issue of boundary too. In other words, why
That's interesting. That's certainly a way to read it. I mean,
it was just a little thought.
no, that's certainly a way to read it, and I appreciate that, David, because we can. There's something going. There's a story being told here, so it's worth reading the nuances. And we've, I think, good for our purposes, kind of extracted some messages here, some legal, sort of approaches here. But it's true that this is a guy talking about his intimate life with his students. David suggests that part of what he's saying is like, don't get involved in my sex life. Like, get out of here. Yeah, I did, like, I'm a frum guy and I did what I did and don't you worry about it. So I think that's right. And I think there are lots of ways that we could spend a while sitting and thinking like, what does he mean? I will not listen to you. Like, why didn't he just say you're wrong? Why didn't he just say I've got to, anyway, okay. So let's continue now. And
Rabbi, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
It says,
Before you do, somebody's got pots and pans. Whose is that? Oh, is that you? Sorry, that might be you.
oh, sorry.
No worries.
Wait.
As long as it's the person talking, it's fine. It's excusable. We all have noises.
Sorry.
There.
He's in there. My husband's doing
Totally
the
fine,
dishes.
totally fine. I thought it was someone else, but you can bang your own pots all you want.
I have a question. It says, if the groom has not performed the act, what if Rabbi Gamliel had his wife, boom, consummated immediately, and that's why he was able to say the Shema. He consummated the act.
Okay,
That's
fair. And I think this goes along with David's reading. Like, let's not treat this solely as a legal text, but like what actually happened. Like, there's a story here, and maybe it's like a little more complicated. And maybe Rabban Gamliel is saying like, get out of my bedroom, Right, okay, fair enough. Okay, but whatever Rabban Gamliel is saying, so far we've been working with a position that seems to indicate that Rabban Gamliel is willing to take upon himself a stricture or a higher level, right, of observance. But in the next Mishnah, it's the same kind of thinking, but just the opposite, okay? So here, now, and it's also interestingly about Rabban Gamliel, he gets married, but then many years later, his wife dies. So it's sort of like the whole journey with his spouse in these two Mishnayot. And it says, Rachatz Laila Rishon Shemeta Ishto. Rabban Gamliel bathed on the first night after the death of his wife. Well, okay, his disciple, anyone who knows a little bit about Jewish mourning rituals will be surprised, and so were his disciples. They said to him, I changed, I think, to students above. Disciple sounds very Christian to me, but students. His students said to him, Master, have you not taught us that a mourner is forbidden to bathe? Okay, now listen, the same question, didn't you teach us something else? But it's a different question, right? Because in the first question, they were saying, hey, you don't have to do this. And now they're saying, hey, you don't get to do this. You took a bath? Like you're in mourning. Your wife just died. Okay. He replied to them, I am not like other people. I'm different. Eini Kasher kol adam. I'm different. And I love, this is one of my favorite phrases in all of the Mishnah. I am not like all other people. Istanis ani. I am very delicate. I just love that. I'm very delicate. This word, and it's a noun. It's a little hard to translate, but like I'm sensitive. I'm a lightweight. I'm refined. I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but that's his response. Like, you're not supposed to bathe during the first week of mourning, right? But he did. He took a bath. So they said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm not." Now, I just want, like, he actually says it out loud here. I'm not like other people. Eini kasher kol adam. So that's an important phrase. And then his explanation, istanisani. I'm delicate. Okay. So, okay. Is this, I don't know exactly how to ask the right question here. Like, is this the same move that we saw above, or is it different because he's allowing himself something where in the last one he was not allowing himself something? I don't have a good question here, but I would like you to try and think about these two answers, which are very similar. where on the one hand he says, no, 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 the kingdom of heaven will remain upon me at every moment. And then on the other hand, he says, listen, I need to take a bath. I'm very sensitive, right? Like, how do you, okay, Inshia?
I feel it's the same thing both times. He feels he's above everyone else and he doesn't have to follow the things that he teaches to his students. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, good. So there are several ways that we can characterize Rabban Gamliel's positions as we're going to find them. But one way, and maybe the easiest way, is just like, he thinks he gets a pass. He's exceptional. He can do whatever he wants. This is not a legal philosophy. This is a guy who does whatever he wants and tells other people what the laws are. The laws don't apply to him, right? Like, it's not any different at all. He said, this is what I want to do in this situation. This is what I need to do in this situation. Don't worry about me. I'm different. I'm different. That law's for you, right? Okay, not a very sympathetic, but certainly a plausible reading of Rabban Gamliel's approach here. Nick?
So right now I'm taking a class where we're looking at like halakha surrounding mourning practices when they come up against a regel. And I think it's interesting because there are laws about like when does Shiva end, when does Shloshim end, like how does, and you know, like what are all the particulars around that? In that class I raised the question of like, well, on a practical level, like what if somebody doesn't want their Shiva to end early, even though halakhically that's the case, like that's sort of what's called for. Like what provisions do we make for that person to ensure that they have the period of mourning that they need? And I think it's interesting because it's just kind of a moment where the rubber meets the road with halakha, where we can make all of these arguments about like, well, this is what should happen. These are the particulars of it. But even like this huge rabbi is kind of like, no, that's not what I need right now. What I need is I need to take a bath and I need to feel feelings, you know, which is, I think it's a very, very human thing to do. And is it hypocritical? Maybe, but I get it, you know?
Great, thank you so much, Nick. Because there you have the other, like a much more sympathetic reading of Rabban Gamliel, which is that, and as you express it, I want us to think about, is it the beginning of a legal philosophy or a philosophy of how to practice Judaism? But let's just stay with Nick for a second. That it just, you just as a voice, a human voice, he's saying, look, I am in the midst of like really personal, you know, important moments in my life, and I need to deal with them in the way I need to deal with them. I know there are laws out there, but that's not what I need right now. Like my wife just died. I can't, don't throw that at me. I need a bath. Like, okay, I need to chill out. I need to, right? That I want to bring Shema into my wedding night. Like, don't tell me, like, this is my wedding night. There's a certain kind of voice that we can be sympathetic to. Now, I also, though, want to suggest from there, and maybe Nick already was suggesting, if that isn't the beginning of a kind of legal philosophy. Like Rabban Gamliel is the legal authority of the day, not the wisest man, but the most authoritative. So when he keeps teaching these things like, oh no, it's different in this circumstance, it's different in this circumstance, is it, as Inshia said, that he makes exceptions for himself and his children and his wife and his own situation? Or is it that he's saying, look, a person has to make calculations, and there's the law, but like there's also your own personal reality, and we're all gonna have to like, to be flexible, to work within the law. Bob was suggesting this sort of approach a little bit earlier. So what do you think of that? Let's see, I'm seeing Hannah and Inshia. Hannah?
I have a lot to say. I mean, that's nice. Like, I like that idea that he's giving those opportunities for lots of people, but that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is, you're right, you have to do it a certain way, and I don't. And I hate that. And also, I think it would be different if his response seemed to be, in either case, well, especially the first one, but in both, like, more generous. It's one thing to say, like, you're right, I told you something else, and I'm choosing to do this. And sometimes we make complicated choices. But instead, he's, in both cases, he's so dismissive, and he's saying, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not like other people. I'm going to tell you what I want, but this is what I'm going to do. And it's hard for me to read that as generous because it doesn't seem like he's reflective in his answers. It reminds me of something we learned, I don't know, a few weeks, it feels like 3 years ago, about this rabbi whose name I'm going to forget, who is like very dismissive of people on his journeys. But it reminds me of this concept in the Talmud, not really a concept, but often when they bring something from the Mishnah and then in order to discount it, they say like, Shane, like that person's different, that person's an exception. We don't hold by that because that person isn't like everyone else. But those are distinctions made by later rabbis. And I think it feels really weird for someone to say about themselves, I'm an exception. It feels different if later on his students or his other teachers say, you know, he was always a little bit different from us. But to say about yourself, like, I'm a star, so I get to do what I want, feels like I can't quite abide by it.
Okay, I hear that. I'm trying to build a halachic philosophy out of it. But we have to really be rooted in the person of Rabban Gamliel. And as Hannah says correctly, the person of Rabban Gamliel, and the other rabbis knew this too, was very unpleasant to be around, right? Like in Shia.
I just want to say that I agree with what Hannah is saying and what you said earlier about how he treated the other rabbi about the certain Jewish holiday when it falls, and how he, forced him to come meet him on the day he thought of, So
Right.
That's why I said what I said.
Right. And we could be dealing with a difficult personality who is drunk on his own authority, right? And it just operates now in his own domain. And there's in some ways very little to learn from that except be careful about people like that, right? And at the same time, Bob and maybe me, like trying to hold on to some lesson that might be valuable here. And Nick, in some ways, gave us the most tender kind of expression of that, which is like, you gotta understand, like, a person's got their life, their situation, right? Hannah's not willing to go that way, right? Okay, so we have Inshia and Hannah, and one. So we're building teams here. Okay, David.
You hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to be a little more generous than Hannah. And I think he is indelicately, by saying he's delicate, is indelicately saying, I'm willing to go the holiness route. In other words, I'm a holy man. And he's got a lot of, this is my first time being introduced to him. So, and I just joined the class, but it feels to me like, listen, I've done the work, this is where I'm at, and being so holy, again, it's sanctimonious, but it just feels a little, I'm willing to go a little more generously in that path with him. In other words, this is where I'm at in life, and I'm a holy man, and therefore, and when you guys get there, you can, make your own rules too.
Yeah, I think that's actually, I appreciate that characterization, because I think it's a different version that we haven't heard yet, which is that there's elitism in it, but it's like, there's a certain, like, practical elitism. Like, there's a spiritual path here. You talk to me when you've studied halacha for 50 years, and you'll know how to make your own exceptions, but I'm further down the road. Like, it might not be the humblest thing to say, but like, this is a reasonable kind of, perhaps. Okay, I want to take one more comment.
Exactly.
Was that?
I just said exactly. That's it.
Beryl.
I'm wondering if he's just like modeling he in this attitude, in this whole like conversation, he's just modeling something for them where they can also have the freedom to do something within frameworks. Like, you've learned the laws, and now you know what? If things don't work out perfectly, it's fine. We don't need to talk about the whole thing. It's just like, what the intention is, the conversation around it, and you're gonna do it in a way that's like works for you.
Okay, lovely. We continue to see these sort of very different, same basic facts, but very, very different reading of these facts. One more critical and one more generous emerging. Nick, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I also just want to, impress that I'm not necessarily saying that I can make a definitive statement about who, Rabban Gamliel was. I mean, our ability to judge his character is gonna just be limited in scope with the material that we have. From what we have, does it seem like he was complicated and he probably did some things that were super wrong? Yeah, for sure. But I think that there's an element of the struggle between the public and private a little bit, which is kind of what I'm picking up from Beryl, you know, of like modeling what the ideal should be to the students and then like actually trying to implement it as a leader, I think can be difficult at the, you know, to toe that line. And I think that's the case for just a lot of different positions of leadership. But I'm also just thinking about this moment of like his wife died, you know, like we may not, if we don't like the guy, you know, if any of us who unfortunately experienced death know that that can be a moment of like completely questioning the world and questioning God and questioning who your place in it, you know? So I think that, well, that's why I choose to be charitable, because it's like, okay, maybe he's been an a-hole here and there. We all have, but his wife died. Let him, give him that space.
Right. Can you imagine if I, as a rabbi, like went to someone's shiva house and like, hey, did you just take a shower? You're not allowed to take a shower. That's not, you know, like, come on. Like, on the other hand, Rabban Gamliel taught them the law, right? So we can go back and forth on this. As Nick said, we're just kind of picking up scraps here of the data that we have available to us. But we have another scene. We've just gotten 2 scenes, and we've got another scene offered along the same lines, but very different now, because if in the first case he said, oh, I must say the Shema no matter what, and if in the second case he said, oh, no, I can't adhere to the laws of mourning, right? So it's somewhat different. This is an interesting case because he is allowing himself something, but in honor of someone else. And the someone else, just as a kind of a trigger warning here, is his slave. Now, slave, I always hesitate to say, it would be, I never know whether to translate it servant or slave. It's more than servant, but it's less than the way we think of slavery in America, because a slave was a sort of an economic status, and Jews could be slaves and other people could be slaves, but it was a wealth class of slave owners, rather than a Jewish or, you know, white or any, you know, that's model for slavery. Nevertheless, it's his slave, and his slave Tavi, and having said that, having put him in that lower position, one of the interesting things about Rabban Gamliel is that he was known to be incredibly fond of Tavi. Not just fond of him, admiring of him. Called Tavi a Talmid Chacham, a name that's reserved only for the rabbis, a wise student. Would teach, in one case, taught a law in the name of Tavi. Tavi knew this, right? Tavi knew that Tavi didn't have to sleep in a sukkah because Tavi's not Jewish, right? Look at how wise Tavi is, right? So we're going to meet Rabban Gamliel's, again, we're going to meet Rabban Gamliel at a moment where he's losing someone precious to him. In this case, the moment after Tavi dies. So, Rabban Gamliel, when Rabban Gamliel's slave, Tavi, died, he accepted condolences for him. In other words, he went through a whole mourning period for Tavi. His students said to him, Master, have you not taught us that one does not accept condolences for slaves? In other words, you mourn for your family, but like not for your servants, right? Servants, slaves, indentured servants. Amar lahem, now this is so interesting. He said to them, Ein Tavi avdi kishar kol avadim. My servant, my slave Tavi was not like other slaves. Kasher haya, he was kosher. Like and the word kosher means like fit, proper, righteous, good, just right. But I'm just leaving the word as it is. Okay, so we've been sitting with these 2 pictures of Rabban Gamliel, or these 2 characterizations of Rabban Gamliel's approach. Like, does he think he's better than everyone else and allow himself personal exemptions sort of on one end, and on the other end, is he just understanding that the halacha is fluid and we all need space within halacha? Okay, now his slave Tavi dies and he mourns it. He mourns it like it's a member of his family, and they say, well, that's not what you taught us. And he says, no, Tavi was different. Now not I'm different, but Tavi was different. Can we fit this in Shia?
So I still stand by what I said earlier, but at the same time, this kind of reveals that, well, as you guys were saying earlier, that he's human, and, you know, he wants to take a shower, he wants to mourn his wife, he wants to mourn his slave, but at the same time, would he allow others to have the same, you know, or same, I forgot the word, but would he allow others to mourn or take a shower when they're mourning their family member, or, so that's what I'm wondering. Would he allow people to do the same?
Yeah, this fits into your earlier characterization, Shia, because Shia's really picking up on the way that it's all about his circle. It's him, it's his sons, it's his wife, now even his servant who's in the lowest level of society, but it's his servant. I love Tavi. Tavi's great. No, Tavi's not a real slave. No, of course you mourn Tavi. But it's just like it's his own. So it's pretty consistent within Shia's reading. It's just like he allows exception. He's essentially, if I may, corrupt in a certain sense. Like the rules don't apply to him or his beloved people. Okay, anyone want to support or disagree with that reading? Other readings? Bob? Yeah.
Yeah, so I still see that tension as we're talking about between these two approaches, but I think maybe Shia, captured a point that sort of shows the in-between, which is, yes, there's this philosophy that there's the law and you have to recognize certain situations where you're trying to be within the law, but you might go, slightly outside, but have the right intention. But I think then the point is it only for him to make that determination about himself or about, other learned rabbis, or is he willing to allow the masses for themselves to make that determination? Where is there wiggle room where just, being a human person and, this beloved servant, slave, where do you allow for that, that latitude that you can treat this person? And once again, is it just for him to decide, or is he going to allow, Joe Average to make that decision for themselves?
Okay, great. This is perfect. This is really what it does come down to. And in fact, we have one more clue that might help us answer this question. But the question, as Bob is posing it, is yes, if Shia is right and he just gives exceptions, VIP passes to his inner circle, then that's correct. But is it possible that Rabban Gamliel is saying something about the way we all live in a legal system and is modeling making decisions for yourself? If anyone saw my post as I advertised this class, I said, this could have implications for modern Jews, because in a way, there's something very modern about this, something that recognizes individual autonomy, a way of saying like, there's a system, but I have individual needs. And I have to say, that's available to us from these teachings, whether or not Rabban Gamliel meant it that way. Meaning, like, what we're left with is some instances of Rabban Gamliel saying, I'm delicate. So now I know that there's a source in Jewish law for leniencies when someone is suffering under conditions in the law that they cannot abide, right? So is there really a philosophy there? Okay, well, the last Mishnah does point a little bit in this direction, and then we get this very we're going to get that, but then we're going to get one more personal piece, and this I think will give us, it's not going to wrap everything up, but it's give us an important insight into who Rabban Gamliel was, because we're also going to hear now from Rabban Gamliel's son, Shimon. And you will remember, if you were with me in my Pirkei Avot class on Thursday, that we learned a Mishnah from his son Shimon, and Shimon said, this is like, really, like, I've always noted how sharp this is. Shimon, Rabban Gamliel's son, said, Kol yamai gadalti ben hachachamim, all my life I grew up among the sages, v'lo matzati tov leguf el shtika, and I never found anything better for a person than silence. Which, whoa, like, if I don't know, Sasha Obama was like, what's great is when the adults just shut up. You'd be like, whoa, I think you're talking about your mom and dad there. You know what I mean? Like, so that's the way Shimon seems to be saying, look, I had a father and he always talked, right? that's one, I just want to imprint that in your head, because Shimon here also says something very interesting that I want us to read in light of the son of the greatest, but maybe most difficult man of the generation. Okay, sorry, I had to give a lot of intro there, but we're going to close off with this, and I want us to see if this deepens or flips any of our understanding so far. Okay, this is the last Mishnah now in this chapter, and it returns to the subject of Mishnah 5, which you read. A groom is exempt from reciting the Shema, but Rabban Gamliel did recite the Shema. The halacha continues. If a groom wants to recite the Shema on this first night of his marriage, he may do so. Oh, so it seems like Rabban Gamliel's position, following Bob's intuition here, has been extended to anyone, at least in this case. If you want, we don't know if it goes the other way. Can you be lenient on yourself and take a bath, right? But if you're being, perhaps if you really care about Shema, it's okay. You can negotiate for yourself if you are in the right state of mind to say Shema. So now that's interesting. Now it does seem to point in this other direction. But then there's one last line, and to tell you the truth, I don't know how to read it. So I'll be really curious to hear what you think. Rabban, and he eventually inherits that same title, Rabban, right? He becomes the next. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the son of Gamliel, says, not everyone who desires to take up the name of God may do so, or should do so. Not everyone who desires to take up the name of God should do so. Now, what does that mean? And think about it. This is Rabban Gamliel's son. We've just heard an extension of son, kind of like a formalization of Rabban Gamliel's position now into law. Like you can be exempt, but also if you want to, you can take it on. But not everyone who wants to take up the name of God should do so. I see in Shia.
I feel like maybe that was his way of saying he didn't exactly agree with how his father handled things or did things.
Okay, good. I think this can be read in a number of ways, but one reading here, and in some ways the one I'm most excited by, is the one that Shia is giving us, which is that Shimon grew up with this dominating figure who made rules for himself and like always had his own sense of the way things went and thought he was so holy. And maybe Shimon, the same one who said, listen, they might as well be quiet, the rabbis. Shimon's saying like, look, it's true. The law is you can make a decision for yours. You can say Shema, but be careful. Like not everybody who I've seen do it, hint, hint, my dad, actually should have done it. Like maybe you should just follow the law. You think you're such a big shot, right? Okay, Nick's got a hand from before, then David, then Wendy.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that, in reading the statement about him choosing or wanting to mourn his slave, which seems like was his friend, and then being confronted by his students and then saying like, well, no, he's different. I think it's pretty serious because I imagine that maybe some of his students were in a similar position. He said, no, you can't mourn them. And then he took that from them, I have to imagine that some of those students had that shared experience, and that gives me pause. That makes me upset, and it makes me wonder, makes me think like, wow, this is much more serious.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. David?
It kind of goes back to what I was saying about the holiness. He can say, I am not like other people. My slave is not like other people. And it just reminds me, I have a brother who's very modern Orthodox. And whenever he gets in the inevitable life negotiations, like how do I balance this with that, he runs to his rabbi. And his rabbi figures it out for him, gives him a dispensation or whatever he gets. But it seems like this is almost the model for that role. That's
sorry. FaceTime.
Anyway, that's it.
Okay, yeah, I think that's right. Like, there's a serious question here about who makes the decision? Like when you have some need within the law, right? The law is hard for you to follow. Who decides that an exception? There are exceptions. There are exceptions made because people are have different kinds of needs, right? Rabbis are doing this all the time. But who makes that decision? Is Rabban Gamliel saying everyone is entitled to make some decisions for themselves based on their own personal needs? Or is Rabban Gamliel saying, I, the master of the law, can make all these decisions for myself, but you should come and consult me, the rabbi, right? And Nick fleshes this out for us in a really painful way, to imagine that they had come to him and he had said, no, that's not the law, not for you. Oh yeah, I know I told you couldn't and I'm doing it now, but like, right, so there's something really, sinister about that picture of Rabban Gamliel, like the one that is really invested in his own authority. And that's really, at the end of the day, he makes decisions for everyone else and for himself, and it all, like, the source of everything ultimately comes down to his privilege and his power, right? But I do want to say there is another way of at least extracting from this, if not reading it, which is that Rabban Gamliel may be offering us something really important and kind of wild. I mean, note the fact that he does this in the very first Mishnah. He says, anytime any of you here that up to midnight, you can do it all night. You have more time than they're telling you that you have, right? And similar here too, he's saying, like, anyone who wants to say Shema, go for it. You have more autonomy within this system than you might think you do. And that would be a really interesting and even kind of progressive in a strange, right, anachronistic way. Okay, let's just take what last comments are up. I think Wendy's got a comment, and then Beryl, and then we'll close. Yeah, Wendy.
I think as we're studying this, I really feel for Shimon. I really do. I think we're getting a real sense of what his father was like and what it must have been like for him to be his son, which is why I can even more understand why he says silence is so important, because he had a father who was quite verbose and said many different things, constantly changing. Yes, no. I mean, this was, right. So I think I understand his saying that silence, sometimes not speaking. Maybe his father spoke and then he's coming back around and saying something else. He uses a lot of words, and those words are changing. And I agree with Nick, it's disappointing in him because he can hurt other people by these rulings.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Well, this response that we have to his son, and we've, in some ways I set it up that way, but I think it's also true that we've read through the other Mishnayot now, and so we've gotten a fuller picture of who Rabban Gamliel was. So now we really are suspect when his son says not everyone wants to take up the name of God should. I will tell you, that's what part of what's valuable about studying the Mishnah like this, because I will tell you the more classic interpretation, like the one the rabbis are inclined to give, is that when Shimon ben Gamliel says not everyone who desires to take up the name of God may do so, usually the medieval rabbis will say, oh, what he meant was not like my father who was perfect and could, but don't think you're as good as my father, right? Now, that's also, by the way, an interesting psychological reading. Like maybe he was so under the sway of his father that he believed in the exceptionalism of his father. But now that we've read through the Mishnah, we're not inclined to read it that way. Wendy's not inclined to read it that way. And I think Wendy's right that the Mishnah I cited where he said, I grew up among the sages and you might as well just shut up. Like that gives you a sense that maybe Rabban Gamliel was part of the problem. Like he was just a difficult man to live with and be around. And that's certainly something that we have to deal with as well. Okay.
And on the other hand, though, you can also say that Gamliel was teaching us there are no absolutes in life. Life is not absolute.
Yes.
So you can look at it that way as well.
Yes. And I think that is in some ways what we walk away with knowing Rabban Gamliel, is someone who was a pretty difficult human being and nevertheless kind of saved the Jewish community and offered them all sorts of ideas that may be still worth thinking through. Beryl, I want to give you the last comment.
I don't know if this is going back, but in the most compassionate view of him, I feel like he allows the autonomy demands engagement. So it's not like you're free to like do whatever you want. And like I'm modeling this behavior where you can just choose to disregard everything. Like if he is giving people autonomy to, in some ways, like do some things and not do others, that requires a sort of engagement with the actual process and decision making, and it's not just this like sort of fascistic rule of like this is what you have to do and there's nothing else.
Yeah,
Which I don't know. I think about that like for myself right now, just like what is the right thing to do in every single situation, and like ideally that would be great if we had that. But as you mentioned, like things are changed and things are nuanced and things are complex, and I feel like that's a recognition of it. And
good. Okay. Yeah, I think it's great to take us back there, because I think that is something that Rabban Gamliel is Rabban Gamliel, and he's interesting for sure. But what I want us to leave thinking about is this question of just how much autonomy and authority do we possess within our own practice of Judaism. And, you know, in some ways it might be easy to say, well, we're modern people. We've like, you know, since Reform Judaism, we don't accept the notion of obligation at all, so we're free. But maybe it's not that simple. Maybe there's something like, I mean, be free all you want, but you need teachers. You need people to tell you how to do things. You need some sort of system. And maybe, I'm thinking a lot, I'll say this and then we'll finish. Thinking a lot about like, when I was taking all these beginners yoga classes, and then I moved to the intermediate classes after about a year. And I remember one of the teachers saying like, okay, you're intermediate students now. We focused a lot on precision in the beginners classes, but now you can start to loosen up a little. That doesn't contradict our message that the precision is important, but just you know the system now, and you can explore a little bit. You can like play with the edges a little bit. And that's we don't hear that message in religious life, especially not legal religious life very often, but it's a very interesting message to me. And it's one that I could speak about how that relates in my own life. And I wonder how you all could speak about this idea that like, look, I've been doing this for a while now. And, you know, when I first started on the path, I was just trying to like learn everything, get everything right. But now I need to figure out like, this is how I'm going to do Shabbat, or this is how I'm going to mourn, or this is how, you know, when those really serious and I get the system. I'm going to have to like give space for me to be me within the system. That's really an important thing, I think, for us all to be thinking about as we just process our own Judaism. All right. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you all. I will see you tomorrow at noon for a Parsha class. Rabbi Brous, I believe, has a talk that she's giving with several other faith leaders tomorrow at 5. So take a look out for that. And then tomorrow at 8, I have a Hasidic thought class. Okay, everybody have a wonderful week. I hope to God this week is better for our country than last week was. I will tell you, I went out to a protest for the first time, you know, very far away, and yesterday, and it did some good to me. It like restored some sense of hope. There's a lot of positivity out there, even as we move through this very difficult period. All right, bye everyone.